The decisions made by a whaling captain that caused half his crew to die. Today we're going to talk about the Navarch. The story is of a ship back in the late 1800s off the coast of Alaska that met a very tragic end. It's an incredible story. It's found in the book 50 Years Below Zero, A Lifetime of Adventure in the Far North. And this is written by Charles Brower. The book is pretty amazing series of stories of Charles Brower. Charlie was the first white man living who settled up in the Barrow area of northern Alaska, Utqiagvik. He married an Eskimo woman and he learned to speak Eskimo. He lived with the Eskimos. He was up there as a mate on a ship involved in the whaling trade, and he ended up setting up trading post up there, going into business in the whaling industry. It was a pretty lucrative business back then. But this story happens about 1897, and by that time Brower was pretty well established up there in Barrow, and he had a ship that was supposed to be coming in July, and it was going to bring supplies to build another trading post in a ways down the coast. Now, this is an area that the ice only opened up around the second week of July for passage of ships, and there was only like maybe a month and a half, 2 month long period where ships could actually get around. And ships were going up here and taking some major chances with the ice because they were up there to catch whales, and they were making incredibly ludicrous amounts of money by killing whales and selling whalebone to make women's corsets and other things back then before they had synthetics to make stuff out of. So baleen, which was the whales' filtering system they used to filter their food, was used for a lot of products. So anyway, Charlie and a group of Eskimos that worked for him went down the coast, and they met the first ship heading north. And the first ship to come in was called the Navarch. This was not their ship, and the captain of the Navarch brought news that, hey, your ship actually isn't coming this year. Now, there was no radios, there was no communication up here. The mail didn't even get up here, so they didn't know. He said, your ship's not coming. They decided not to build that extra trading post. So, hey, you want to ride back to Barrow? Sure, no problem. So Brower jumps on the Navarch, and they start to sail north. Well, in one evening they anchored up, and it was a place called Icy Cape. So this area is the best place to shelter in Icy Cape is on the east side to get away from the west wind, which is where the open ocean comes from the west in that location. And for some reason, Captain Whitesides, the captain of the Navarch, who was the architect of this entire disaster, decided to anchor up on the east side. And he actually didn't even anchor, he tied off to a floe of ice. So in the evening, Charlie's out on the deck talking to the captain, and the captain admits the reason why, because earlier in the day, another ship had headed north, a ship called the Carluck, and Captain Whiteside's wife was traveling with him, and the Carluck captain, his wife, Captain McGregor's wife, was traveling with him, and the two women didn't get along. And so Captain Whiteside's took chances with his ship in order to satisfy his wife, because she was upset about the idea of being next to the other captain's wife. It was a bad decision. That was bad decision number one, anchoring on the north side of Icy Shoals in the west wind, because their ice floe they were tied off to started to drift loose, and they got caught in the ice. And this happened a lot of times up there in those days. When these guys were playing fast and loose on the edge of the ice, if the ice drifted in one direction or another, or things froze up, or it all packed together, they could be rendered helpless. This ship was a steamship, but it didn't matter. It got caught in a bunch of ice, and the ice all closed in around the ship, and they couldn't go anywhere. Then when that big group of ice was all packed around the ship, fused together, that whole ice floe started drifting, and it was drifting them way out into the rest of the ice pack. So they had no way to get loose. Now, as the ice was closing in around the ship, the Cap made his next bad decision, which was he basically became paralyzed. And this is something you should remember in decision making: is never allow yourself to become paralyzed and not make a decision when things are tough, because there were some vital hours, based on Charlie Brower's telling of this story, that the captain might have smashed his way out of the ice, and he just kind of stayed there paralyzed, didn't make any decision, and the Navarch continued to be slowly drifted out into sea. They drifted about 30-40 miles away. Days went by. They were spinning in different directions based on how the ice was drifting. They were listing. The ship was listing. Ice was crushing around it. Basically, everything kind of piled up into one area and it stopped. And the captain decided, makes his next bad decision. He decided that they were going to abandon ship. And so they had 3 whaleboats, which are umiaks, the Eskimos call them. These pretty medium-sized boats. I don't know, probably 10 people could fit in one at a time. And they had those in the ship. They took those out, got them ready. The captain said, "Hey, Charlie, what do you got experience here? What do you suggest we bring for this journey? We're going to abandon ship. We're going to go to the edge of the ice. Then we're going to row. When we get to open water, we're going to row into where we can get to shore." Brower said, "You got to have 3 to 4 inch thick hardwood keel on the bottom of these boats, because we're dragging them along the ice and they're going to get chewed up and busted up. And you got to bring a bunch of stuff to skins and stuff to patch any holes that you make in the boats." Well, the captain decided he was smart enough that they only needed 1 inch keels for the boats. And so they, instead of 3 to 4 inch thick keels, they made 1 inch keels. And they didn't bring anything to patch up the boats because that was extra weight they didn't want to carry. So they started dragging these boats across the ice, and like about a day and a half goes by, and the boats are basically tore up. They're just all this jagged ice and stuff, just too much dragging over too much conditions and rough ice, and they were unusable. The boats tore up to the point they were unusable. So then they had to decide what to do. They weren't going to reach land without the boats. So they, at this point, the captain made another bad decision. He lost his head, and he was basically running. He was running around aimlessly, giving everybody orders, and according to Charlie Brower, he's basically just making things worse and adding to the confusion. They abandoned the boats. They smashed one of them up and burned it to have a fire so they could cook some tea. These guys had a very rough journey. Then the captain made his next bad decision. He broke down and started crying, and he dove into a bottle. Apparently he had brought some whiskey along for himself, and he started pounding the whiskey. And then they all started to head back to the ship. So it was a lot of hours to get back to the ship. And at one point, the captain basically just yelled at everybody, every man for himself, and he took off running for the ship. He left his wife behind in care of the first mate and Charlie. They basically had to carry his wife, Mrs. Whiteside, back to the ship while the captain was back there just taking a nap. They all got back to the ship. Everybody made it back. Okay? This was bad enough, but at some point they decided they had to abandon the ship again. Basically, I think what the decision was that the ship was crushed in the ice, and they weren't sure whether, when the ice broke back apart and melted, if the ship was even going to float. And so for the time being, they had plenty of shelter and food on the ship, but as soon as the ice let go, they could be dead. I mean, they could be stranded and drowned, basically sink. When the ship sinks, it's all over. So they didn't know. But at that point, they decided to abandon the ship again. The captain asked Charlie Brower, who was the most experienced person. He lived up here. He had been here many years. He knew what he was doing. The captain said, "Why don't you take most of the crew and you go ahead and find it, blaze a path to get us in the right direction to get towards land. So they took off along the ice pack. And the deal was the captain was going to in the meantime, before they abandoned the ship, they actually built another boat. The captain was going to take a few men, take this boat, and take plenty of supplies and food so that they would be good to go. So a lot of the guys, they just packed light. They didn't bring any extra boots. They didn't bring food, water, anything. They packed really light, and they took off. Captain was coming with the boat. Well, it was like maybe a day goes by, and they stop, and the last guy in line catches up to the crew, and he says he had started out with the captain. He said the captain turned back. He ordered everybody with the boat to turn back and go back to the ship. Like, what are you talking about? What happened? He said, I don't know. They must have forgot something. He's got all our food. He's got our supplies. He's got everything. He's got the boat. So they didn't know what to do. They kept going. Basically, they began the March of Death. Charlie, and according to his diary and his book, there were 32 men on that march without a boat, without supplies. And 16 of them died along the way. They went 11 days without food. There were men who would drop off. One guy shot himself finally after so much suffering. So many of them just finally couldn't move anymore. They couldn't go anywhere. They couldn't go on. They were too weak, and they had to leave him behind. They were in a race against time. The ice was melting. The ice pack was moving. What happens, Charlie explained it based on what he knew about this area, was that the ice pack, as it heads north in the summertime, it splits in two different directions. And the portion of the ice pack that goes off to the west never sees land again. It's gone. It's that vast, wide open ocean. It never reaches land. It melts in the ocean. The portion of the ice pack that goes east, oftentimes the winds will blow that ice towards the north shore, like in the north coast of Alaska. And those ice flows can stay close enough to shore where they would have a chance to be seen by a ship. And he said, we need to keep going because when that ice pack splits, I want to be on the east side. So they were pushing. They went and went and went. They made it. They made it to the east side of the pack. The pack split. They basically got as far as they could. They jumped out on an ice floe, and they drifted for days. They survived. They had no food. They survived by drinking melted water on the ice pack. Because, of course, you couldn't drink salt water from the ocean. But they drank melt water from the ice pack. No food. And apparently of the 16 or so that survived, about half of them were unconscious when they were found. These guys were spotted by a ship called the Thrasher under the command of Captain Barney Coogan. And the watchman that was up in the crow's nest thought he saw a herd of walrus on the ice. And the captain said, that can't be. We've never seen walrus this far north. And he glassed it and he saw the men. They couldn't believe it. He rescued the men. He brought them back to Barrow. And they found out when they got back, the first thing Charlie asked is, what happened to Captain Whiteside? And the story was unbelievable in a bad way. The captain, when he had ordered the crew back to the ship, he had decided to go on and abandon those 32 men on his crew. And there were, I think, 4 of them and him and his wife that took the boat and they went a different direction. And they carried the boat across the ice until they hit open water, and they rowed across open water for about a day. And they landed on an island not far from Barrow, and I believe it was the revenue cutter, the Bear, spotted them after several days. They had a tent, they had food, they were relatively comfortable and in good shape. And the sad thing is that according to one of the quotes from Charlie at the very end of this story is, "Had Whiteside followed us with the boat as he promised, my whole crowd of 32 might easily have been saved. They all could have survived." It was unbelievable. So of the ones that did survive, I think there were like 16. There's a few conflicting news reports, but I believe 16 survived. And of those, a few others actually died after having been rescued. 4 of them had to have their feet amputated. The rest of them kind of just drifted off as sailors did in those days, and nobody heard from them again. The crazy thing about this whole story is the Navarch actually didn't sink. The Navarch drifted back towards Barrow in October. An unbelievable thing. I think the people there said that there'd only been one other time when a ship had drifted back in that direction after being caught in the ice. This would have been the second. And the Navarch came back. This was like 2 months after they had abandoned her. And there were approximately between 4 and 7 people who stayed on the ship and refused to go with the captain after that first journey across the ice where they tore up the boats and they all came back to the ship. There was a group of people there, and in some places I've seen 7, in some places I've seen as few as 4. But that group of people refused to leave with the captain because of all the poor decisions he had made before. They said they'd risk their lives with the ship rather than the captain. They were still on the boat when it drifted back towards land in October. And the boat was brought in, rescued, if you will, by another whaling boat. And the men actually refused to get off the boat at first. They said they were claiming the ship for themselves and they were going to salvage it and it was theirs. What happened though is in that year it was a really unusually cold winter or cold summer, and a whole bunch of boats got stuck in the ice that year, and they were stuck. When a boat gets stuck in the ice up there, say in early September, it ain't coming out till the next July or August. So those boats were stuck through the winter, and they only had enough food to theoretically have gotten them back to the lower 48 on their return journey. And so they weren't going to have food to get through the winter and then get back home. So they were scrambling around Barrow. And this was after Charlie had gotten back and recovered. They were scrambling around Barrow to try to round up enough food for all these ships that had been stuck in the ice. And the people had to come into shore and they had to house them and everything. It was quite a task. So anyway, they convinced the people on the Navarch that they needed those supplies, and dozens and dozens of people spent days hauling supplies from the Navarch back into land, and it helped a lot of people get through the winter. They actually really needed a source of heat, and the Navarch was full of coal. They tried to salvage that, and a couple of idiots ended up going in there with a candle or something, and they accidentally started on fire, and the whole ship burned before they could get the coal. But moving on, Captain Whiteside, what happened with him? It's really sad and unfortunate that he made those decisions and did that to those people. I had to search afterwards, after reading this story, had to search out and see if I could figure out whatever happened to him. And I did find some information. Apparently, he never did command another whale ship, which was good. And he would die less than 3 years after that ordeal with the Navarch took place. He was stricken while serving as a cargo chief aboard a steamer taking supplies to the Nome Gold Strike, according to a newspaper article. Charlie Brower survived, lived to be 82 years old, and he wrote this story along with a whole pile of other stories about his 50 years up in the Arctic. Pretty incredible book, 50 years below zero, and I plan to tell a few more stories about it in videos to come.